Close to 100 million American adults have fat building in their liver. No symptoms, but it can raise heart disease risk by about 45%, and routine blood tests often miss it. After 40, the odds climb. Do you know how yours is doing? I'm Sophia Hart. I read the research for a living, and my job is to translate it into what it actually means for your body. So let's answer that question together. Start with something you've probably lived through. You go in for your yearly checkup. They draw your blood, run the standard panel, and a few days later someone calls with the words you were hoping for. Everything looks normal. You exhale. You go back to your life. And maybe, quietly, something still feels off. You're more tired than you used to be. The energy that carried you through your 30s just doesn't show up the same way. The weight that settled around your middle seems to shrug off every effort to move it. You bring it up, and you get the old refrain, eat a little less, move a little more, lose a few pounds. And out the door you go. Here's what that result didn't tell you. A normal reading on a routine panel does not mean your liver is healthy. It means the one marker they happen to measure didn't trip an alarm. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where this story lives. And before we go one step further, let me say this plainly. This isn't your fault. If fat has been collecting where it shouldn't, your body isn't broken and you didn't fail at anything. It is doing precisely what biology built it to do under the conditions of modern life. We'll get to those conditions. So why wouldn't you feel any of it? Because of one strange fact about this particular organ. Deep inside, your liver has almost no nerve endings that register pain. It's the uncomplaining workhorse of the body, filtering your blood, managing your fuel, clearing what's toxic around the clock, never once calling in sick. It can sit there carrying far more fat than it should for years, even decades, and send you no signal at all. No ache, no warning light, nothing. For a long time, this was simply called fatty liver disease. Then, in 2023, an international panel of liver specialists, led by Dr. Mary Ranella, did something their field almost never does. They formally renamed it Metabolic dysfunction-associated steatotic liver disease. A mouthful, I know, but the new name hides the single most important clue about what's really driving this, and the two of us are going to crack that clue open, so stay with me. A few minutes from now, I'll show you the one line on a standard blood report that can read perfectly fine, while fat is quietly filling your liver, and the simple, inexpensive check that sees what that line cannot. And hold on to a second thread while you're at it. This quiet process doesn't stay politely inside your liver. It reaches outward, toward your heart, your blood sugar, and the odds you'll be living with 20 years down the road. Knowing why is the whole difference between catching this early and finding out the hard way. Let's go inside and watch it begin. Let's crack open that clue. The new name leads with two words carrying all the weight: metabolic dysfunction. Read them closely and you'll see what the field finally said out loud. This was never simply a liver problem that appeared from nowhere. It's a whole-body fuel problem that happens to surface first in one organ. The liver isn't the culprit. It's the messenger. To understand why, meet the hormone running the show, insulin. Every time you eat, your pancreas releases it to usher sugar out of your bloodstream and into your cells for energy. That's the system working as designed. But push it hard enough, for enough years, and your cells start tuning the signal out, a state called insulin resistance. Picture a doorbell. Ring it once, someone comes. Ring it 1,000 times a day, and eventually no one bothers to answer. So the body does the only thing it can. It rings louder, flooding the bloodstream with more and more of the hormone to force a response. This is where your liver gets pulled in. Those high, relentless levels don't just shuttle sugar. They hand the liver a standing order: store fuel and build more of it. Which brings us to the part that catches almost everyone off guard. You'd assume the fat sitting in your liver arrived from the fat on your plate. It mostly didn't. Under that pressure, the liver turns into a small factory, taking surplus sugar and spinning it into fat right there, day after day. The textbooks call it de novo lipogenesis, literally making new fat from scratch. Think of it as a private assembly line that only powers down when the pressure eases. This isn't a hunch. At Washington University in St. Louis in 2020, a team ran an exquisitely precise study. They compared 3 groups: lean adults, adults carrying extra weight but with clean livers, and adults whose livers had quietly filled with fat. Then they measured exactly how much new fat each person's liver was producing. The fatty liver group's assembly lines were running in overdrive, and what tracked most closely with that overdrive wasn't any single meal. It was how high their hormone levels stayed across the entire day. Sit with what that means. You can do everything you were told: smaller portions, longer walks, more effort, and if that underlying signal is stuck in the on position, the factory keeps humming regardless. The midsection that won't budge, the effort that never seems to pay, that isn't a flaw in your willpower. It's a control system jammed in the wrong setting. And there's a second supplier feeding the line, closer than you'd think. Remember the padding that tends to gather around the middle in your 40s? That deeper layer, the fat wrapped around your internal organs, known as visceral fat, isn't just along for the ride. It's metabolically restless, and it has something the softer fat under your skin does not: a private channel that empties straight into your liver, feeding it a steady drip of raw material. 2 sources, 1 destination. Now the shape of the problem comes into focus. Hold on to one last question, because it decides how early you could ever catch this. Of all the fuels pouring down that assembly line, one pours faster than the rest, and it hides in foods most people would never call sweet. I'll name it shortly. But first, let's see what all of this has been doing to the one number on your chart you've been trusting. So here it is, the number you've been trusting. On a standard panel, your doctor glances at a liver enzyme called ALT. When liver cells are under stress, ALT leaks into the blood, so a high reading can flag trouble. The catch is the word high. Most labs don't sound any alarm until that value climbs past roughly 40. But the level that truly signals a metabolically healthy liver sits much lower, closer to 30 in men and around 20 in women. So your result can land squarely in the normal column while your liver is quietly anything but. And it gets more unsettling. When researchers screened a vast group of higher-risk adults in ordinary primary care, more than 90,000 people, a sobering share of those whose enzymes read perfectly in range turned out, on closer inspection, to already carry real scarring inside the organ. Sit with that. The single reading meant to reassure you is a smoke detector with half its battery pulled out. Silence is not the same as safety. Now the part I love telling you, because it's genuinely hopeful. Catching this early needs no needle and no expensive machine. There's a simple score, it's called FIB4, that a clinic can calculate from 4 numbers already sitting in your routine results, with no fresh blood and no extra bill. Your age, your platelet count, and 2 liver enzymes, the ALT you've already met, plus its partner, AST, sitting right beside it on the very same panel. The math is almost elegant. It weighs your age and AST against your platelets and ALT, and it works for a quietly logical reason. As a liver scars, AST tends to drift upward while platelets slip down, so the score tips toward trouble long before you'd feel a thing. It can't diagnose anything on its own, but it's a smart, cheap first filter, sorting who can be reassured from who deserves a closer look. And that closer look is painless, too. A quick scan called elastography, which you may know by the name fibroscan, reading both how much fat and how much stiffness the liver carries, in minutes, with no incision at all. Dr. Rohit Lumba and his team at the University of California, San Diego, have spent years sharpening exactly these tools, pairing that simple score with imaging, so this can be caught long before it ever whispers. Which finally lets me name the fuel I promised. Of everything pouring down that fat-making line, the fastest accelerant is one particular sugar: fructose. And here's why it hides so well. It lurks not only in the obviously sweet, but in the savory, the bread, the pasta sauce, the salad dressing, the condiments quietly built on added sugars and corn syrup sweeteners. Worse, it doesn't wait for that jammed signal we talked about. The liver breaks it down almost regardless, and it trips the fat-building switch directly. In a controlled trial in 2021, 94 healthy men spent 7 weeks drinking a moderate daily dose of it, and their livers stepped up fat production even as their overall calories held steady. An identical dose of plain glucose did not. The type of sugar, not just the amount, changed what the organ did with it. So the picture is nearly whole. A quiet factory, 2 suppliers, and 1 accelerant most people pour in without ever knowing it's there. What we haven't touched is the bill, what this silent process is doing right now to your heart and your blood sugar, and the timeline that decides whether it ever turns dangerous. And, encouragingly, just how reversible it still is. That's next. One quick pause before we get there. If this is the kind of explanation you wish someone had handed you years ago, the why beneath the what, subscribing is what tells me to keep making it. That's the whole reason I get to keep doing this with you. So let's talk about the bill. And the first surprise is where it comes due. You'd expect a problem that begins in the liver to end in the liver. For most people, it doesn't. The American Diabetes Association, in a 2025 report, said it plainly. The leading cause of death in people carrying this condition isn't their liver at all. It's their heart. Here's the link. A fat-laden liver doesn't sit there quietly. It reshapes your blood chemistry. It pushes out a surplus of blood fats called triglycerides, along with a steady trickle of inflammatory signals that roughen the smooth lining of your arteries, setting up the narrowing that ends in a heart attack or a stroke. The organ you weren't worried about quietly becomes a second factory, this one manufacturing cardiovascular risk. That relative whose heart attack seemed to arrive from nowhere? For many, it didn't come from nowhere at all. Then there's your blood sugar. And here the trap closes into a circle. Remember that stalled signal, the cells that stopped answering the hormone? A fatty liver pours fuel on it. In a 2023 study that followed more than 20,000 adults, those carrying fat in the liver were over 2.5 times as likely to go on to develop type 2 diabetes. And it runs both ways. Once that diagnosis lands, it roughly triples the odds the liver scars toward something far worse. Each condition makes the other harder to escape, a loop quietly tightening on itself. Which brings us to that far worse and the timeline you asked about. For years, most fatty livers stay silent and steady, but in a meaningful minority, the fat turns to fire, an inflamed, injured stage doctors call MASH. Inflammation lays down scar tissue. Scar tissue hardens into cirrhosis, the stiff and failing version of the organ, and in some, it seeds liver cancer, the kind known as hepatocellular carcinoma. The cruelest twist? Unlike most liver cancers, this one can appear before full cirrhosis ever does. It is already climbing the list of reasons Americans need a new liver, especially women, and on current trends, more than half of U.S. adults are projected to carry some form of this by 2040. The clock isn't loud, but it speeds up. Once you pass your mid-40s, the deep belly fat and the cells still ignoring that signal accelerate together, and the quiet years grow shorter. How seriously does medicine now take all of this? Enough to rename the disease in 2023 and in 2024 to approve the first medication ever aimed at the scarring stage, an active ingredient called resmetirom. For decades, there was nothing but lifestyle to offer. That a targeted treatment now exists at all tells you this is no longer filed under just a little extra weight. But I promised you hope, and I meant it. This entire cascade is not a one-way road. The liver is among the most forgiving organs you own, and in its early chapters this is strikingly reversible. Fat that took years to gather can recede with the right inputs. So the real question was never whether the damage is permanent. It's what actually moves the needle. And that is exactly where we go next. So what actually moves the needle? And here's where I have to be honest with you, because the answer is not the worn-out advice you've been handed for years. Eat less, move more, watch the scale. Treats a number on the bathroom floor as the goal. It was never the goal. It was barely even the scoreboard. What shrinks liver fat is anything that lowers the specific pressure we map together, the stalled signal, the liquid accelerant, the deep fat with the private pipeline. You aim at the mechanism, not the mirror. And the reward comes fast, because this organ renews itself quicker than almost any other tissue you own. Start with the one that feels almost unfair. Movement lowers the fat in your liver, even when the scale refuses to move at all. In controlled trials and a 2025 research review pulling them together, people who trained around 3 times a week saw their liver fat measurably fall, with barely a change in body weight. Read that again. The bathroom scale can sit perfectly still while the thing that's actually hurting you quietly drains away. And the kind that builds muscle pays a double dividend. Muscle is the furnace where surplus sugar gets burned, so the more of it you carry, the less fuel floods that production line in the first place. The work was never failing you. You were just watching the wrong gauge. Next, the single highest yield change on your plate. And it isn't deprivation. It's pulling the liquid sugar out of your day, the sodas, the sweetened coffees, the healthy smoothies, and the added sugars tucked into savory staples. That's the fuel that pours down the fat line fastest, so cutting it returns the most for the least sacrifice. Build the rest of your eating around fiber, protein, and unprocessed fats. Ease off the refined starches, and you've turned the pressure down at its source. When weight does come down, and on this path it often does, almost as a side effect, the liver responds out of all proportion. The 2024 European guidelines note that trimming roughly 5% of body weight begins to clear the fat, and closer to 10% can calm the inflammation and even walk back early scarring. But notice the order. The weight loss is the byproduct of lowering the pressure, not a figure you white-knuckle toward. 2 quick notes before we close the loop. First, a small vindication. Large studies keep linking regular coffee drinkers to less liver scarring, one of the rare pleasures the evidence is firmly on your side about. And second, a warning. Walk straight past the liver detox aisle. No cleanse, no tea, no bottle of capsules has ever matched what those unglamorous free levers do. The supplement industry is selling you the feeling of action. The research is offering you the real thing. None of this demands perfection. The liver is the forgiving organ, and caught early, this story doesn't just stall, it reverses. Which leaves one last thing I want you to carry out of here, more than any single tip on this list. Let's bring it home. So here's the one thing, the thing I'd want you to keep long after the details fade. Everything we covered today shares a single, unsettling feature. It happens in the dark. The organ doesn't complain. The standard result can pat you on the back while the trouble compounds underneath. The fuel problem wears a calm face for years. That silence was never your friend. It was the whole danger. And it's exactly why this is one of those rare threats where simply knowing changes the outcome. You can't act on what you can't see, and as of the last 20 minutes, you can see it. Think back to how we started. I asked whether you actually knew how your liver was doing. Be honest, before today, most people can't answer that, and they assume no news is good news. Now you know better. You know that a calm number on a routine panel isn't a verdict. You know there's a simple score hiding in labs you may already have, and a painless scan that settles the question in minutes. You know the fuel that floods this fastest, and the handful of unglamorous moves that can drain it back out, often before the scale ever reflects a thing. That isn't a small thing to walk away with. That's the difference between finding this on your terms and finding it on its own. And here's the part that should leave you lighter, not heavier. Caught in its early chapters, this is one of the most reversible conditions in all of metabolic medicine. The people who turn it around aren't the lucky ones. They're the ones who stopped mistaking quiet for safe and asked the question while there was still everything to gain. If this is the kind of explanation you've been missing, the reasoning underneath the rules, the why beneath the what, then this channel is built for exactly the way your mind works. Subscribing keeps it coming, and it quietly tells me which corner of this science to map for you next. It costs you a second. It shapes everything I make, and I genuinely want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me the question about your own body that you've never been given a straight answer to, the thing that's nagged you for years. I read every single one, and the sharpest questions become the next video. Someone reading this has the exact question thousands of others are quietly carrying. You came here to understand something real, and you stayed to the end. That tells me everything about how you take care of yourself. Keep asking the inconvenient questions. They're usually the ones that matter most. I'm Sophia Hart. I'll meet you in the next one.